Hello and welcome to another edition of the Chris Recorder Dialogues. I am your host, Dr. John Thomas III, the editor of the Chris Recorder, and we're here to do another one of our famous book discussions. We have with us Dr. Cheryl LaRoche, and we are here to talk about this important book, probably one of the most important books to be written about the AME Church in recent times since Dennis Dickerson's history, The Apostle of Liberation. Now, you've heard us talk about Richard Allen being the Apostle of Freedom, but today we are talking about Bishop William Paul Quinn. What if I told you there was an AME bishop who could break Broncos, who was a gold miner, who was a boxer, and got robbed and lived to tell the tale? That was Bishop William Paul Quinn, truly the Western pioneer bishop. And we thank you, Dr. LaRoche, for bringing his story to us. And so welcome today on the Chris Recorder Dialogues. We are delighted to have you here.
I have to say, it is an honor. It's a blessing. And I'm very grateful for this interview because I have been in the depths of the Christian Recorder for so long. And so it's like my research life and my real life are intersecting. So thank you for the invitation.
Yes, we're delighted to have you here. And we said, for you sharing this story with us, we definitely wanted to make sure that the AME Church knew about this. So let's go on and get into this talk about what made this book coming to be and telling a little bit about yourself. So first, Dr. LaRoche, tell us about what is your connection to the AME Church, and tell us about your own personal faith story.
Well, I was not raised in the AME Church. So I wasn't born AME. I didn't know Quinn's name initially. I came on this journey as an archaeologist, and we were excavating and looking at free Black communities. And in those communities, every community in the West, I was in Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana, and in those communities, there was always a church and a cemetery. And the question became, because everywhere you read historically, the church is always central. It's always a church first. But after years of looking in the ground, looking at census records, looking at the formation of community, I realized that the people came together and brought the church with them. Not that the church was there and brought people to it. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that was a really distinction. When I began this journey, I actually had to spend a lot of time understanding the difference between AME Zion, all of the other early denominations that formed at the same time or before Richard Allen began to form the AME Church. So my understanding that the Black Baptists are also very active. And so I find myself on any given Sunday, either at an AME church or I can be with the Baptists, a little less with AME Zion. My family grew up Catholic. I also deal with the ecumenical folks. I go with the Buddhists if I know them. So I really have a very broad religious and spiritual life that touches on multiple dimensions of spirituality.
Wow. That's refreshing to hear that, it's always interesting when we hear of people who come to the AME Church to learn about us from different places and different understandings. And I guarantee you that you probably understand the difference between AME Zion, and CME better than some of the members of the AME Zion, and CME Church. So, Dr. LaRoche, you are like you said, you are archaeologist and a scholar. So tell us a little bit about your academic journey and your own writings.
It's a very unusual path that I took. I was the archaeological conservator for the African burial ground in New York City 30 years ago. Wow. I began my journey with the artifacts of the enslaved people who were buried in New York. Mm-hmm. And because of the nature of the artifacts, I was probably one of two people who were allowed to access them, to touch them, to work on them. It was considered to be highly spiritual, highly personal. And this alternative spiritual journey began when I was introduced to the ancestors. So they're also inside of this sort of spiritual expansion. because of the really sacred time that I spent with the bones and the artifacts of our ancestors. From there, I had been doing graduate level work, but didn't have the credentials and was being invited to do things. And people were very upset that I was there without the credentials necessary for the level at which I was working.
The paper, as it were.
I didn't have paper. I had the chops. I had the chops, but not the paper.
Yeah.
I went back and had been studying the undergrad as a conservator. And I won't get into this because it's confusing, but we did a job taking some faces out of a basement of a church in Syracuse, New York, that was an Underground Railroad church. Mm-hmm. And that's really started my journey. So my journey actually started in the basement of, as I'm thinking about it now, a Wesleyan church.
Wow.
And not only do I understand the difference between CME and AME Zion, but also United Methodist, Southern Methodist, all the white Methodist churches as well. And so Methodism, I would say, is something that I have had to learn inside out, which is why a lot of the explanation in the front of the book, because I realized that most people, AME or not, did not understand this. Yeah. And so I have to say that my love and respect for the AME Church is deep and profound because I understand at the deepest levels the impact, the dedication, not just the religiosity of the church, that is sort of understood, but the multiple layers of activism and dedication that the church has displayed across the arc of its existence.
Wow. And I just want to take a step back to talking about the communion of saints. About the ancestors. Bishop Leith and the former pastor Mother Bethel, who is now the bishop of the 16th district, and we were talking one day when he was ecumenical bishop, and I was talking about some of my work that I do in academic work regarding Black and Latin America, and so we were talking about religions, and he said, AMEs believe in ancestors. Christians believe in ancestors. He said, every time we say the Apostles' Creed, we mentioned the communion of saints. Ancestors are part of the communion of saints. And he said, he reminded us, he said, one thing AMEs really don't highlight, for example, you look in the Mexican American community and other Latino communities, you see Dia de los Muertos, which is November the 1st, which is the Catholic Day of All Saints Day.
Yes.
All churches have All Saints Day in their liturgical calendar. Yes. It's just Protestant churches sometimes de-emphasize it, but Bishop Lee said, I really wish that we would understand that we have more in common with these groups, and ancestors appreciating those who've gone before is not something that is foreign to us. It's something that is not only a part of our African cosmology, but also a part of the Christian faith. So I'm so glad that you brought that up.
But you have to really realize, so I spent a lot of time in the book talking about all these memorials to Bishop Quinn after he died. Those memorials are exactly what we're talking about. We might not use the word ancestor, but we come in and memorialize people. We remember them. We have anniversaries. We come back. We celebrate their life. There's no difference there. One of the things that the current climate should really teach us is that language just is a group identification of a concept, and that the concept of the ancestors and memorialization, it all is the same thing. And by the way, when I was working in Philadelphia, I came to Mother Bethel. I know Bishop Leith, and before he became Bishop Leith. And so many of the AME people that I worked with over the years, I have known Reverend Tyler when he was at AME. So it's interesting to think about how these things connect in ways that people don't necessarily say, but don't realize that that's what they're doing.
Yes, yes, yes. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the connections and some of the, I'll just tell you, I really did enjoy reading this. Some of the things that you do in the book to make these connections work. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but let's think of it. How did you get interested? So we knew you were
Oh, please.
AME. You saw this. How did you get interested in Bishop Quinn?
Listen, this man has been on. So when I went out west for my dissertation to excavate these 5 sites, I was sent to excavate 3. They put 2 more on.
Mm-hmm.
I get to Illinois and they say Bishop Quinn started our church. Okay, it's a little tiny church, Rocky Fork in Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
I go to another place in Illinois and they say Bishop Quinn started our church. All right. I go to Indiana. It's the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
But this is what really set me over the top. And I spent all this time out there excavating, looking at all these sites, understanding the Midwest. I come back to Maryland and I tell my dissertation advisor about this man and that he had all this influence and I can't understand why I didn't know him. And my dissertation advisor walked me around the corner to Quinn Chapel in Frederick, Maryland. Now I'm like, what? This man is across the country. But here is the question for me. It was like, how could someone with this much reach and influence I didn't grow up AME. It wasn't a name that was inside of my world. So it wasn't like, oh, yeah, I know about him. I heard about him. I grew up with him and I read about him in Sunday school. None of that. Wow. So my curiosity was so deep because I saw what he was doing. Mm-hmm. I was so respectful of the work that I saw that he accomplished. And there was so little when I began, because I probably began 25 years ago. When I began, there was almost nothing. Mm. I had to, and then I thought maybe I mentioned Ambassador Palmer. Ambassador Palmer called me up one day, started talking to me, and 20 minutes later, I said, "Who are you, and why are you calling me?" Someone had given him my name as another Quinn scholar. Mm. He was AME. He had grown up AME. He had AME ministers in his family, and he was just following his own religious faith and tradition. Mm. But he came to me as a researcher and a scholar to help work with him to uncover some of the things that maybe weren't going to be as accessible to him as they would have been to me, because, you know, I have all the access from the academic world, as you know. So you have all these databases and all these other things that you can go into. That combination of Ambassador Palmer and myself, him being deeply AME, and really, you know, he would say to me, I don't have the minutes from some year. And I think to myself, how do you know all of this? Well, now I can say the same thing because I've been doing it so long. But he is the one that gave the AME church to me. From there, wow. I couldn't let it go. I just couldn't let it go. I'd get another little fact, and I'm like, oh, and I have to tell you, Dr. Thomas, that tracking these churches, it took me years to get them straight. It took me years to get the chronology. There was never anything that I read, even all of Payne's work. If you look at Daniel Payne's work, he doesn't spend a lot of time talking about Paul Quinn.
He doesn't.
He doesn't. And Payne is the gold standard for historiographers for the AME Church up until, you know, recently when you have, no, I've used all of them, you know, Revenue, all of them. So I think that this kind of journey and the combination of being an Underground Railroad expert. So this is the point that I have to make. And I hope this doesn't sound too egotistical. I don't think anyone else could have written this book because I needed to have expertise in the Underground Railroad. Every time I saw a name, I knew, oh, okay, you were from Indiana or you're from Ohio. So I would look and then I'd see John M. Brown 3 states away over in Oberlin. I knew who that was. I could bring him back in. So then when I'm up in Canada and I see that, you know, there's Paul Quinn is on a map in Canada, I can combine all of that because of my Underground Railroad expertise. Then I have to come back in and look at the historical lens, which you talked about, this integration in the book, because I don't like the way Black history is often told as if it's on an island someplace and in action removed from what's going on nationally. And so I hope I did, bring the historical component. You have to understand what's happening in 1844 when the Methodist split, when Paul Quinn becomes bishop. There are all of these things that the combination of which led me to Quinn. And so I say that his writings, the religious piece, all of that, I hope I've given someone to now the biblical scholars and the religious professors to look at in a new way.
And I before we go any further, I have to give a shout out to Presiding Elder Moody, who was the pastor of Quinn Chapel, Chicago.
Yes.
Who linked us together. And I think that's a good place to start this part of our discussion.
Yes.
You know, Quinn Chapel, Chicago is the oldest Black church, oldest predominantly Black, historically Black church in Chicago.
Yes.
And it bears and we consider it, even though we consider it's the mother church it's the mother AME church in the Midwest.
Yes.
And it is the beginning of our frontier move across.
Yes.
And he's the one who led me to you. And so one of the things that I really want to, and I don't want to spoil the book for the people who need to read this, because let's be very clear. This book, I'm going to show it again, needs to be, and I anticipate it will be the same way that we have assigned Newman's book, Apostle of Freedom.
Yep.
This book, Apostle of Liberation, needs to be assigned in our boards of examiners. It needs to be shared by our lay organization, because in this book, what you do is you don't only give the life of Bishop Quinn, you give this integrated narrative. And well, again, I'm not going to spoil the book because I need my readers to read this book. But some of the things that I like as you write the book at the beginning, you give this retelling of the founding of the church, the Christmas conference, the early days of African Methodism, but through the lens of following Paul Quinn. Like, I didn't realize that Quinn was at the First General Conference,
yes,
that he was ordained by Allen.
Yes.
And one of the things that you bring up is the people that make history, because there's probably a good reason why Payne didn't include much about Quinn in his history, the same way that I didn't realize that Quinn had left the AME church for
Yes.
2 years because he and Allen didn't get along.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why AME and AME Zion never became joined is because Richard Allen and Peter Varick never got along. And so the personal aspect that we sometimes just, don't understand, well, what did all these things happen? And when we reduce figures to historical stories and not people, we forget about some of this stuff.
Yes.
And you do a great job of bringing in the narrative, and then mentioning that Jarena Lee preaching at what we now know as Bridge Street was huge, to have a woman preaching at that church. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And the way you write is a way that is accessible. It's not overly academic. Anyone can pick this book up and read this book and get a good understanding of the early history of the AME church. So I was excited to read this. And again, I encourage people to really pick this up. And it's stories that we may know in bits and pieces, but you bring the narrative together. And so I just was really excited to read and see this.
Well, one of the things that I said at the outset, how honored and excited I was to be here, is because a lot of these things, I was just blown away when I started to read about Jarena Lee. And when I finally understood that she's talking about the same church that I'm looking at under a different name, because it takes a while to realize that one time it's Bridge Street and next time it's High Street and then the AMEW, so you see all of these things. When I finally realized, and she talks about writing, I can't tell whether I think she's talking about Quinn, but she never names him. So I didn't want to speculate and go down that path. But for someone to recognize, how can I say this? You need a depth of knowledge to really understand the depth of what I have said and what I have done. You really have to understand when you read about New York, the real groundbreaking kind of information that is in the book. So for other people, they'll be like, oh, that's very interesting. But for you, and this is the thing that is really heartening for me, as my grandmother used to say, I know you know. And so that was very important for me. And to see, again, I didn't know that Jarena Lee had come to the AME Church to publish her work. And I saw that, was that in the Christian Record, or where did I see it? I saw it in one of the AME documents. And so those kinds of things, the narrative of Black history, if I may move to a wider thought, is generally not interwoven. So the intersections, because they're so hard to make, I was only able to make that connection because I understood deeply the differences that were going on. I understood what was going on in New York. I understood so much that I could finally say, oh, I understand what she's talking about over here because I'm working over here. And the AME Church has such reach in this time period that I would predict J.M. Brown, somebody needs to write a book about him. He's everywhere. And all of the early ministers, yes, I think I'm saying this correctly. I don't know much about Ed Waters. They're all connected to escape from slavery, liberty, freedom, and the Underground Railroad.
And one of the things that you do interesting, and there's a retired presiding elder and judge of the church, Thomas Best, who wrote a book about Morris Brown. And I find interesting that you say, we talk about the four horsemen. We did that for the bicentennial 1787. I'm going to say 1787. We did the bicentennial in 1987, 88. We talked about Richard Allen, Paul Quinn, Daniel Payne, Herbert Neal Turner. But you add Morris Brown in as someone that we need to uplift as one of the fifth ones. Tell us why.
Well, Richard Allen, of course, is the founder of the church. He has built already in his lifetime a mighty institution. It's already a important organization. He recognizes Morris Brown's talent. Morris Brown has what we would consider a mega church today. He has a mega church in Charleston. He is a forceful preacher. And when the Denmark Vesey uprising, or whatever you want to call it, occurs, and Brown has to leave, Richard Allen takes him in immediately. I know who you are. Come here. Let me shelter you. Let me give you sanctuary. Let me protect you, because you are a marked man in South Carolina. And so to actually have him recognize Morris Brown's talent, basically from the following that he has, from what he has done in his congregation back in Charleston, is huge. But Morris Brown, after Richard Allen passes, carries on by himself and carries that church over, keeps it going, and does essentially the same thing to Paul Quinn that Richard Allen did to him. I recognize your organizing skill. I recognize your talent, and this is what the church needs now. We need you. And what does Morris Brown do? He immediately, after Quinn comes back, sends him to the West. I understand. I recognize talent. I recognize capacity. I recognize what you're good at, and I know how to use you. So I would argue that it is Morris Brown that ensures the longevity, the continuation, and the life and the viability of the AME Church, not Daniel Payne.
Wow, you just gave us some food for thought. So let's dig a little bit more into this book and to the life of Paul Quinn. So this book is in, I believe, this book is in set 11 chapters. So what was your favorite chapter to write, or the favorite part of your book, the part that gives you that aha moment as you were writing it?
Well, I had said to you that I had been in multiple states in the West for my dissertation. But I'm a New Yorker. I was actually born in New York City.
All right.
And I studied when I was at the African Burial Ground in Lower Manhattan. So I saw all of that history being developed. Quinn and the AME Church and all the things I talk about in that book were not in any of the documents that were being developed for the project that I was on. To come into New York, I understood New York. I had read a lot about the African Free School, so this was not new. But to find out that Paul Quinn is across the street from one of the most famous institutions in New York at the time, not just for Black people, but one of the most famous institutions in New York at the time, the African Free School, was just mind-boggling to me. To see him operating in New York, to see him, his story comes together in New York. And I can say this because so many of my friends inside the AME Church, the people, I'm sure most of you and the scholars and the people who study the AME Church, you knew he was there. I would suspect, and so I have a question for you. How much did you understand about Paul Quinn in New York before I wrote the book?
For me, Paul Quinn was always associated with the West and with the Underground Railroad. The New York piece, I did not know.
Yes. Yeah. I knew he was there because I had stumbled across his name years ago. So a lot of these pieces that I told you that kept plaguing me were there. But the New York piece for me is the groundbreaking scholarship. Those 2 chapters, I was even amazed that I had 2 chapters worth of information. Those 2 chapters, because if you look, the AME Church, while it has a lot of strength, it doesn't have a huge presence in New York. There's no Quinn Chapel in New York. There's, all of those, when I plotted the chapels, New York doesn't have one.
Yeah.
So it sort of like, there's always the people who know me know you make an example, and I'm going to tell you something that happened 100 years earlier. I really think that by knowing this early foundation, he didn't just pop up out west. He had honed his craft. He had honed his Underground Railroad activities from the earliest days. He's associated with some of the most famous people on the Underground Railroad from the beginning. But again, he is very elusive. It's taken me all these years to figure it out. And it also would never have happened without new digitized documents. It would never have happened if I couldn't have gone, all the digitized newspapers. So now you can go in, you can Google his name, you can put his name in these search queries, and you can see the 30 articles about Paul Quinn. They're not all the right Quinn, but you can track him in a way that it would have taken me a lifetime and a half to write this book without the electronic resources.
Wow. So for you, chapters 3 and 4. For me, I'm not going to lie, I enjoyed the circuit riding chapter. That's that chapter 6, where you see Quinn out in the rest, where you see Quinn out in the West. That was my chapter. And
okay. Yes.
Yeah, that was my chapter. I enjoyed that one. And I appreciate as well that you clearly and define and show where Quinn was born, because there's this myth we had he's from India. In fact, in the 1950s, one of the preachers said, we must go back to India to where Quinn came from. And Dickerson said it in his book, but you were like, clearly like, look, he was from Belize, what was known as British Honduras. Yes, his mother was probably East Indian, but he was born in British Honduras, which is now Belize. So let's just go ahead and irony of ironies, you do mention Bishop Byfield at the end of the book, and it was Bishop Byfield who actually went to Belize during her tenure as Bishop of the 16th District.
Oh, okay.
And she reached out to churches in Belize, and I believe we still have that church that came over to the Connecticut Church. So we actually finally made it into Belize some kind of way to where Quinn was actually from, not his mama's country, but his own country. But I just enjoy, like, you spend a lot of time in the first part saying, I know y'all heard this India story. Yes. He is from Belize.
Yes, yes.
And he used that British citizenship to protect himself when he was doing his work in the 40s and in the 1840s and 50s. So I just loved reading that. So in any book, there are things that you have to leave out. So what are some pieces that if you had 300 pages, you'd put it in, but in about 230, you can't fit everything in. So what are some things that were left on the cutting room floor, as it were?
Well, there are two things. I suspect that there'll be an edited volume that comes out next. I don't have anything concrete, but I know Quinn was in Tennessee. You know that I mention it, but I really don't have the details. Pam Tilley, who was your lay historiographer for many years, and I were talking about going to Tennessee. So there's a Tennessee chapter. There is definitely a Michigan chapter. I have not delved into his life in Michigan. And most of that is because it would require me to be there on the ground to do the elementary research, because I couldn't find it from the sources that I had access to. So that's two. I've also been talking to a young scholar here in Maryland who has been looking at Quinn as a Mason. And so that is probably one of the other aspects that I think would be in that next volume. And you know, I if I can get to it, I don't know. I'm laying out for somebody. I'm laying out a book proposal for the early life. I think a trip to Belize to really look at the Quaker connections, to really cement the Quaker piece, along with the mahogany work and the early work of Quinn's family. If they're wealthy mahogany dealers, we should be able to find them. You know, I think Henry Louis Gates needs to put Paul Quinn on his show, so we could really delve into some of these things that we're asking about. And then I think that I did not look to understand the international influence. Do I see Quinn Chapel? How is Quinn interpreted internationally? I didn't look at, you know, the Caribbean we know, but in Africa and places where we know, for, you know, Turner is really involved. Where is Quinn in that as well? So there, and even the Civil War piece, which of course, you know, we don't want to spoil everything, but Quinn is also there in the Civil War. I think that almost every place where I've gone, these things can be amplified. The one thing, or the things that I did leave out, there is a anecdotal biographical sketch that I relied on for the sort of the human interest pieces. That normally would have happened is that most academic historians would have left out. And this happens to us as people of color. We're legislated into illiteracy. We can't write our own narrative in the beginning for many different reasons. And if we could write, we have to still have access to pencil, paper, and publishers. So we don't get to tell our own narrative. When our narrative is finally presented in ways and in forms that are not acceptable to historians, they discard it.
Yep.
And so now I have this anecdotal, wonderful sketch of Quinn that that's been sitting there, and I'm sure being ignored. And so to come back to that, Elaine Welsh, who is from Quinn Chapel, who knows a lot of the people who knew Paul Quinn. She is actually doing sort of an ethno-historical history, and that's how we would get away with it today and legitimize it. She is actually interviewing and talking to the people who knew Quinn. And there are a lot of anecdotes because he is a real prankster. He's a real practical joker. And I was very mindful of his ascension to the bishopric. And so I didn't want to put too much of his playful, sort of prankster-ish aspects of his personality in there. I think you got enough to know that he is he's really a lighthearted, he's a complex man because he will fight you and he will love you with the same energy and passion. And so I just realized that some of the anecdotes were they didn't need to be there, but they would give you an idea of if it were a movie, for example, you would really get an understanding of his playfulness from some of the pranks that he pulled.
You know, it's interesting, you know, like, for example, just to give a comparison to Newman's book on Allen, and where he talks about we get a little bit of the character of Allen when we hear just this one little snippet about how he and Absalom Jones were best friends, but they fell out over a business dealing and didn't talk to each other. They didn't talk to each other for years. Ended up suing each other in court. But eventually, at the end, Absalom Jones and Allen reconciled, and Jones left Allen his favorite cane, which Allen used until he died. Yes. And Jones was one of the consecrators of Richard Allen. So it's like, you know, we see these stories and hear and see these things, and it's like these were real people.
Oh,
you know, Allen was a stubborn person. Paul Quinn was a trickster, and Payne was, well, we know Payne and Turner from what we can see in the sanitized history, they definitely did not agree. So I can only imagine what would have been like to see them in person talking to each other. But you have done for Paul Quinn what I know others have done for Turner to finally bring out his narrative.
Yes.
What I was remembering the name, Andre Johnson over at University of Memphis has published a lot of Henry Manil Turner speeches to where we can see his writings.
Yes.
Payne, of course, because he wrote himself, has his story told. But I'm glad to see that you have given the fourth horseman his due. So let's dig in now. We know September is Underground Railroad Month. So let's talk about, I mean, this book is literally titled AME Bishop Paul Quinn and the Underground Railroad. So give us a little bit of an understanding of how Paul Quinn related to the Underground Railroad.
So let's go back first and speak just a little bit about the Underground Railroad. So this is International Underground Railroad Month. And we know that we have this static understanding of the Underground Railroad, people escaping from slavery, and up until recently, the Quakers helped them out of slavery. And that is the classic understanding. Let's back up, which is what I'm always doing. Let's back up because the first response to slavery, when the ships hit the shores throughout the diaspora, is escape. People escape into the hills. This is what maroon communities are all about. Around, if you look in Brazil, if you look in Suriname, if you look in the Caribbean, if you look in Jamaica, the Jamaica Maroons, that is the response to escape from slavery. It gets a name, which is kind of like a theme that we're talking about. It gets a name in the mid-1830s, but the behavior starts the moment slavery begins. So I want to make that distinction. Paul Quinn is actually involved with escape from slavery before the Underground Railroad gets its name. And I hope I made that clear. in the book because I wanted to expand for people to understand that he was helping people. He's going into these communities very early, and after he's gone and the history starts to be written and understood, these places begin to be analyzed as Underground Railroad sites. So I really came to much of my conclusion because almost every single church that Paul Quinn started, in their narrative, in their church history, which is often not taken seriously. I mean, I crave church bulletins. I crave those anniversary memorials. I crave all of those things where they say, this is our founding. This is how we began. It's usually a paragraph or two. When I was on Long Island and I found out that he was out there, that was a paragraph and a half at the beginning of a centennial celebration. So Quinn and his churches all say we were Underground Railroad churches. But again, from the kind of history and the way historians are trained, that isn't enough. But what happens is then it gets ignored. So, not only can we not testify in court, but they think we're lying in our history too. I decided I would believe what I read and track what you say and see how can I verify your claim. And a lot of that has been very, what's the right word? Not scattered, but it had to be really dynamic. I had to reach for unlikely places to prove the point. So Quinn is there. His churches say that they're Underground Railroad churches. He is arrested a couple of times, but I can't find the arrest records. And I know if I ever do find them, he's being arrested for aiding and abetting people escaping slavery. I talk about his arrests 3 different times. So he is arrested. That's 2. And then in New York, he pops up before he's famous, before anybody knows who he is. And because, thank God, there was Freedom's Journal, which happened to be writing, that's the first Black newspaper in New York, that happened to be publishing at the same time Quinn was there and wrote about him. So that's all the ways in which we pulled together his Underground Railroad narrative.
Wow. And, it's interesting that this book we're doing now, as earlier this year, we published an article from Bishop Wicker, who is the bishop of, he has the 3rd Episcopal District, which is Ohio. Oh gosh, I'm missing myself. Ohio, West Virginia, and the western part of Pennsylvania. And in that district, they are beginning to, the National Underground Railroad, from parts of the Park Service. They are beginning to work through the AME churches. And it was Ironton, Ohio, I believe, that they just did. And so to see, the AME bishop go to the church and say, even that and just be part of the process, just echoes the work that Paul Quinn did. And the fact that we take a step back and reflect on the fact that the churches, we just didn't preach freedom. We actually used the church for freedom and planted the churches in places where you could get to freedom. That is sometimes, like you said, we think this Underground Railroad descended from on high. No, we intentionally put these churches here. Wow.
When you go to Pittsburgh, and a lot of these churches have moved. So, when I was moving around, and I'm in Kentucky, and I am there in Louisville, I have to understand that the first church, the mother church, it was, right on the water. So all of those things that you're saying is absolutely true. And I've been hammering away at the Network to Freedom to say to them, and I'll say this to you because it has to be a cooperative venture. I map AME churches. I map the Underground Railroad. It's a land-based and water-based endeavor. And so Indiana was the place where I was able to prove the intersection of the Underground Railroad routes and the AME churches. And that's why that map is always with me, because it was the easiest place. It's a newer state. and the Quinn was so active, and so it was easy to do. Now, what I have been saying, and again, I'm laying out another research project for somebody because I can't get to it all. If we were to really map the early AME churches across the country, the little ones that are gone, the little one-room places that have burned, that have been torn down, that have fallen down, if we start there, if we go back to some of the existing cemeteries that were associated with the AME church, so we can at least mark it on the map. So the first piece of history has to be, where were you on the original ground? Mm-hmm. So I think in the beach settlement, you have an early church in Indiana. Where were you first? Mm-hmm. So, you know, Pittsburgh, you talk about Quinn Chapel in Chicago, but for me, AME really starts to flourish in Pittsburgh. Mm-hmm. So you got to come back to that gateway to the west. And that's a very, we know that they're up on a hill. We know that the first church is near the water. We know for you get out to Kansas, they're on the water. If we could map the first structure of the AME church across the country, I believe either it will intersect with Underground Railroad routes, or it will completely dictate what a new map of the Underground Railroad looks like. And we haven't had that since Wilbur Siebert in 1890. So I cannot emphasize enough. And when I'm speaking to my Baptist friends, the Baptist church is doing the same thing, but the AME church, the reason why I was able to focus on the church is because of your organization, because of your hierarchy. Baptists are a little more diffused. They're a little harder to do this with. But I am saying to you that the AME church has a layer of history yet to fill in because of your activism on the Underground Railroad.
Wow. Well, we're coming. I have no words at that to say, wow. I mean, we are coming to the end of our hour. And when we have guests here, we always want you to say something to the church. But I would dare say you just gave the church a charge in terms of protecting our history and legacy. And I think sometimes people talk about, membership numbers, financial crisis and things without understanding the good we have done and the good we continue to do, particularly in this moment in our country when we see attempts to erase history, attempts to retell history, and understanding that the Underground Railroad, we were not passive participants in the Underground Railroad. We were the constructors of the Underground Railroad. And this man right here, Bishop Paul Quinn, was indeed one of the conductors and the chief engineer. So,
yes,
Dr. LaRoche, please share some final words for us with the AME Church. So first of all, we already told everyone, go get the book. And Dr. Tyler will have you on at some point, probably, I'm assuming definitely by Founders Day next year, to share more from the historical side.
Okay.
But as the recorder, we wanted to bring you on first since we're all up in this book. So I say, we're going to bring her in first, and then my historiographer colleague will enjoy. But Dr. LaRoche, if you could just share some final words with us.
I want to share something with you specifically in the Christian Recorder first. Mm-hmm. So I was reviewing the 1848 General Conference because this is the first year that Quinn advocates for the Episcopal Address. Mm-hmm. And I went back to read what he said. And, you miss things, even though you read it many times. And one of the things he called for in 1848 was the establishment of a religious periodical to be the organ of the church for religious and moral information. He's calling for the Christian Recorder in 1848. And 3 years later, in 1852, we see the Christian Recorder comes into being. And so I really know that he was, I'm like the fruit of Quinn's labor That's one thing. And I think and I wanted to put a plug in because we're going to start a series called The Resurrectors. And if you go to theresurrectors.com, we're having a Kickstarter campaign to start this children's series to resurrect the histories that we are talking about, to go in and pull out these forgotten histories. And the last thing I'll say about the Underground Railroad and about history in general and about your history specifically, history empowers you. History, just as we have this spiritual sustenance that we derive from reading the Bible, that we derive from going to church, that we derive from the sermons, that this deep religious inspiration that we get from all of that, history also has a part to play in enlivening our spirit. And I don't think we understand the powerful messages that we can give to our children and to one another, moments of encouragement that come through our history.
Wow. Wow. And I think, again, especially in this time, we cannot take for granted telling the history, making sure that we tell our people history and we remind others of our history and that we have a history. And Dr. LaRoche, you have done an excellent job in making sure that we have that by giving us this.
Yes.
So thank you, ma'am, for your work. Like I said, we've already showed the book enough times. But one more time, this is The Apostle Liberation, AME Bishop Paul Quinn of the Underground Railroad by Cheryl Jennifer LaRoche. We are excited. We were excited to have you here. We're looking forward for you to be heard by us. You know, I know your website, you are available for speaking engagements, and some of the bishops who will listen to this, you also bring her to your district. On that note, thank you. And everyone, we thank you for joining and watching us, and we look forward to seeing you again on another TCR Dialogues.
Thank you for a wonderful interview. Do I just leave?